Friends, on behalf of India International Center, I welcome all of you to this very important program. My name is K.N. Srivastav and I am the director of IISc. Uh, we are today going to have a review of midterm review of Indian economy. The program is going to be conducted by Dr. K.P. Krishnan, and we have got very eminent speakers to participate and speak on these very important subjects. He would be introducing the speakers. I would like to just say a few words with regard to this program as well as about Dr. K.P. Krishnan. First of all, about the program itself. Dr. Malcolm Atseshaya, one of the very well-known economists of our country, and who was also a life trustee of our center, he actually started this program when he was dominating the scene of IISc in those good old days. And he conducted this program himself, associating other eminent economists for several years. After his death, a trust was formed in the name of Dr. Malcolm Atseshaya and his wife Elizabeth. The trust is called Malcolm and Elizabeth Atseshaya Trust. This trust has been supporting financially the conduct of this program since 2001. Let me also make a very personal confession, which I shared with Dr. Krishnan. Way back in 1977, when I was writing the IAS exam, in the general knowledge paper, there was a question with regard to Dr. Malcolm Atseshaya as to who this person was. There were choices given. Unfortunately, I did not know, and I couldn't answer that. But I did not take the risk of making some wrong, kind of ticking, because that would have given me negative mark. I feel very fortunate that I got this opportunity of being with the center with which he has been so closely associated, and I am participating in such an important program initiated by him. Friends, before I hand over the floor to Dr. Krishnan, let me say a few words about Dr. Krishnan himself. Dr. Krishnan is my colleague from Karnataka cadre of IAS. He has held very important positions in Government of Karnataka and in Government of India. He's an economist, very well-known economist. He's also been writing in the newspapers relating to the economic matters very often. And there are several, distinctions to his credit. But let me say here that he spent a considerable longer, period of the service life in economic affairs ministry and, ministry relating to that. I'm sure we are going to have a really critical analysis of our, economy, and this will definitely help all those people who are interested in the subject to understand the subject much better. So, with these few words, once again, I extend a very warm welcome to all of you. And now I hand over the floor to Dr. Krishnan to conduct the proceedings of the day today. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much, sir, for that very generous introduction. Let me first begin with a word of thanks to the director and his team for enabling us to participate in this important review of the Indian economy. I also want to thank my panelists who, at very short notice, have been very kind in accepting the invitation. We have Mr. Rajiv Mishra, who is Senior Economic Advisor in the Department of Economic Affairs, Ministry of Finance, who, among others, was among other things, is the principal author of the mid-year economic review, which came out in November 2023. He will be speaking primarily with reference to that document and more recent updates. We also have with us Dr. Sudipto Mundle, who is again a person who doesn't require introduction to this audience, spent many years in the Ministry of Finance, in various other institutions of repute in India, including the NIPFP, NCAER. He currently is the chairperson of the Center for Developing Societies, CDS Trivandrum. Dr. Mundle also spent many years in the Asian Development Bank at Manila. Thank you for thank you for joining us this afternoon, sir. We then have Ila Patnaik. Ila is a professor of economics who spent many years at the NIPFP, New Delhi. She was principal economic advisor in the Ministry of Finance, Government of India when we were colleagues. She now is the chief economist of the Aditya Birla Group and is based out of Mumbai. And to my right is Mr. Joshua Felman. Joshua was resident representative of the International Monetary Fund in India, again, at the same time that many of us were in the Ministry of Finance. And from there, he moved to the research department of the IMF in Washington. And I have very little hesitation in saying that he perhaps tracks the Indian economy probably more closely than most of the others in this room. And very often, the most recent happenings in the Indian economy are matters that I hear from Joshua. He continues to retain his interest in Indian economic issues and writes extensively on them. Thank you again. He's based out of Washington. Thanks for joining us today. Given this very distinguished panel, actually my role as moderator is actually absolutely minimalist. Set the context and keep time. So it's going to be done in exactly 2 slides. A lot of these are data and observations that I've picked from Rajiv's mid-year economic review, and with a little bit of updation in terms of the current situation. As the document brought out, the real GDP grew at 7.7% in the first half of FY24, and in Q2, the second half of the first half of 24, it grew by 7.6%. Essentially, it is very resilient consumption and investment that drove this growth. Investment primarily was government capex, and within that, as Pranjal Bhandari points out in her latest review that came out a couple of days ago, the capex by Indian states increased by 46% year on year in FY24. It's quite a serious jump in capex. The mid-year economic review also brings out the tax buoyancy, actually tax and non-tax. Revenue earnings not only have been robust, but they are marginally higher than the budgeted numbers. The fiscal deficit is broadly expected to be in line with the budget announcements, but the aggregate fiscal deficit is likely to be still high, essentially because the huge increase in the state capex that I pointed out earlier is not matched by a commensurate rise in state revenues. So overall, Indian states' aggregate fiscal deficit is likely to rise. Combined deficit of center plus state will not rise vis-a-vis what is budgeted, but continues to be high, and vis-a-vis our expected glide path in terms of reaching those desirable numbers. I'm sure both Rajiv and Dr. Mundle will have something to say. And all of this is happening in a global context where global economic activity is weakening. In addition, there is considerable geopolitical tension and there is considerable weakening of global trade. both of which have direct implications for the Indian economy. One implication that we saw clearly is the net FDI number. There is a decline in the net foreign direct investment into India in H1 of 24, broadly in line with global patterns. But as far as the Indian economy is concerned, this is important. We need to keep this in mind. It's begun to pick up in October 23, but what lies ahead is something we'll get to hear from our distinguished panelists today. Now, in terms of the sort of questions that I thought, and these are not the only questions or the questions that you need to answer, these are the questions that struck me. Flowing out of the mid-year review of the Indian economy, it talks about reprioritization of expenditures and essentially trying to do this very difficult reconciliation while safeguarding the expenditures that are required for the vulnerable, whether it's food related subsidy or direct cash transfers to farmers. While doing all this, continue to strengthen capex. The mid-year review of the Indian economy also talks about moderating inflationary pressures. Now, in the light of this background, the 3 or 4 questions that I thought I'd place before the panel: A, the big sort of jump in the Indian growth rates that we saw in the first, say, decade of this century clearly was driven by private sector capex and private sector exports. And while private capex is still sort of yet to pick up, the government has sort of made up for the deficit, in particular the state capex. We can't escape going back to a situation where private sector investment again becomes buoyant. Though there are incipient signs of this, is this likely to happen? And if so, is it likely to happen soon? Two, given supply side constraints and global factors could still play out trickily on the food inflation front, what is to be the sort of what is the expectation on this? Clearly, there is a lot that needs to be done on the employment situation. The mid-year Indian Economic Review mentions this, but I think this is a problem that probably needs greater address by us, greater address by the immediate budget of February 24 and the regular budget that will follow. And to my mind, to get back to a higher growth path and to get back to picking up private sector capital investment, what are the sectoral reforms that are required? Are we likely to see an unleashing of various sectoral reforms? That, in essence, is the context that I wanted to sort of place before all of you. With this, may I now request Mr. Rajiv Mishra from the Ministry of Finance, Government of India, to speak for about 10 minutes on his assessment of what to expect in terms of economic developments, and in case it's possible for him to say, given his position, I'm not sure he can speak about what to expect in the budget, but clearly, what is the expectation in terms of the questions that the budget will address? Over to you, Rajiv. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. At the cost of some repetition, I may like to put forth my views regarding the economy in general, and also recognizing the fact that this budget is mostly interim in nature, and more policy announcements, more definite direction of the economy will be announced in the regular budget. So I believe it is, first of all, important to understand the government perspective on the economy, which we have tried to narrate in the review, in the monthly economic review, in the mid-year economic review, and perhaps add a few dimensions to it, which may not have been so explicitly stated. One thing is very clear. For the last 3 years, we have been growing at 7% plus rate every year. Even the advanced estimates for FY24 is indicative of a 7% plus growth rate. Given that this growth rate is somewhat higher, or rather higher by considerable distance as compared to most of the major economies in the world, there is something more to it than just growth numbers. And it is the resilience of the Indian economy, which has been strong enough, big enough to combat the pandemic, and also to combat the monetary tightening, which has become necessary in the wake of increase in commodity prices following the war in the Ukraine. At the same time, monetary tightening globally has taken a toll on growth, with the result that output is slowing, trade is slowing, and as far as external stimulus to growth is concerned, it may not be there for at least a year or so. By the end of 2024, it is generally expected that the Fed would start cutting rates. But until that time, India will have to depend on the domestic stimulus to take the required steps forward. So far, as we have also stated in the midterm review, which is practically most of the annual review itself, our domestic demand is strong, it is not disappointing. Consumption is strong, private consumption. We feel because of the declining unemployment rates and declining inflation. Investment is strong, as you've already stated, mostly because of public capex. We find some green shoots in private investment also coming up, but we will not be very certain about it unless government data for 2022-23 is released in the month of February, that is, next month. Apart from that, because global trade has been slowing now for over 1 year, our exports, the merchandise exports are challenged, but still they are not doing so badly as one would think them to be. First of all, our exports in electronic goods have jumped. Our export basket is slowly and steadily changing in favor of engineering goods. And besides this, we are also doing pretty well in net services exports. And by almost 100 basis points, we have increased our share in the world services market between 2019-20 and FY22-23. And this has mostly to do with the fact that we have skilled, specialized manpower in providing back office support to global business development. On the supply side of the economy, supply also has been strongly responsive to the increase in demand. And we see a lot of high frequency indicators like index for industrial production, index for core industries, and even some of the important services indicators doing well, doing strongly. Particularly if we look at PMI, manufacturing and services, they have been in the expansionary zone for the last more than 24 months, which is indicative of a strong supply response. Perhaps a critical data to analyze is the core inflation. It has started to decline and has been declining for the last 6-7 months or so, further reflecting the fact that there is a better matching between supply and demand in the economy. With declining inflation with smaller trade balance. And one aspect about the trade balance, which I did not tell you before, is that uh, more than the exports, it's the imports which is improving the trade balance in the economy. Like in volume terms, imports have been rising, reflecting the strong private consumption in the economy. But since commodity prices have been non-rising, have been plateauing, in value terms, import value has come down, resulting in improvement in trade balance. And this is further leading to narrowing of the current account deficit. So with inflation declining, current account deficit also narrowing, and the fact that gross fiscal deficit is expected to stay within the level projected in the budget in relative to GDP, we feel that our macroeconomic vulnerabilities are as minimum as they could be and have played a critical role in supporting growth so far. But having said that, these things can change overnight. If global commodity prices increase, then straight away our current account deficit can widen and inflation will be fueled further. And if monetary tightening also follows following that, then there could be a capital outflow from the country. Our foreign exchange reserves will also come down. So, in a matter of few days, if global adversity increases, uh, our situation can also change. So, all this while, in our monthly economic reports, month after month, we have been stressing the fact that macroeconomically we are good, but that is just a very, very fragile position. A couple of things I will say about monetary and fiscal policy and try to come to the main budget question uh, before I conclude. As far as monetary policy is concerned, we believe that it has been doing a great job. It has not bothered to stay ahead of the curve as it was initially accused of. The approach has been calibrated, and right now the policy rates, the repo rates, are at the highest level in the last 1 decade. After this, if at all some demand tempering has to be done, that is being done by quantitative tightening, by sucking out the excess liquidity in the economy. And we feel that going forward, we do not expect the policy rates to come down as long as our demand is strong in spite of them. As far as fiscal policy is concerned, we have already seen in the slides which you have shown earlier that there has been a rebalancing. Uh, there have been a rebalancing of the expenditures more towards capex, and without disturbing the fiscal deficit target. And in addition to that, we have been very circumspect in trying to finalize or rather detail the social expenditures. But we also are aware of a glide path. Although the glide path was indicative, we feel that it needs to be adhered to because presently, as many commentators have said, India's interest rates to tax receipts is at a very high level compared to many other countries in the world. That has to be brought down, which can only be brought down if our outstanding debt declines. So we come back to this issue of disinvestment and monetization of assets, which should give us enough proceeds, at least over the next 2-3 years, to bring down the absolute size of debt. Perhaps these are the issues which will be looked at when we are talking about the budget, not only in the interim one, the regular one, and one following after that. Because presently we feel that maybe because of the market conditions, disinvestment and monetization of assets have not happened to the extent envisaged. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rajiv. It was an excellent summary and also on the dot of 10 minutes. So thank you very much. Can I now request Dr. Sudipto Mundle to speak for about 10 minutes?
Is this on now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much, Krishnan. After listening to his, those just two slides, very interesting introduction, excellent introduction, and also Rajiv's presentation, I think there's very little that I need to say because everything that was important to say has been said. But still, I will mainly react to a few of the points in Rajiv's presentation, maybe also reflect on some things that Krishnan said. But let me preface my remarks by saying that listening to Rajiv, I had a sense of deja vu because 34 years ago, Rajiv, I was doing exactly the job you're doing now, which tells you how old I am. But one of the challenges we used to face, I'm sure you have the same thing, is that after all we are representing government and how to put the best foot forward for the government and at the same time do it in a credible way that people don't think you're just engaging in wild propaganda and so on, because then you lose your credibility. So this is a fine balancing act. It's challenging. And I must say that I have been reading everything that Nageshwaran writes or says. I'm frankly quite impressed by the job he's doing and also your presentation today. I think you all are getting that fine balance of, putting the best case forward for how the government is managing the system without ignoring all the challenges that lie ahead. So, a couple of now, first of all, on the growth projections, as we all know, India has been growing at more than 7% per annum for the past 3 years. Some of it is a reaction to the rebound effect of the negative base effect during the pandemic, and also there was a second round of that with the Omicron variety and so on. But so if you look at actually instead of the annual growth rates, if you look at the quarterly growth rates, you will see that there's a gradual decline. And that's also implicit in the projections being made. It is assumed that the growth rates in Q3 and Q4 of this year will be a little lower than in the first half, and Q2 was a little less than in Q1. So it is possible that next year we would have a growth rate of maybe sub 7%. It could be more. It doesn't really matter a great deal. But, something above and below 7% growth rate is also consistent with, I think, the macroeconomic demand side story that you were yourself outlining, which is the very challenging global situation, which is reflecting, of course, on our internal demand situation. I do not talk too much about it because I don't want to tread on Joshua's stuff. That's what he's supposed to be talking about. But the other thing, again, as Krishnan mentioned, first of all, I think the kind of thrust that this government has been giving to investment is really unprecedented. It had already started during when Mr. Jaitley was the finance minister, and has continued. The 5 budgets that the present finance minister has presented are really very impressive in terms of its transparency, in terms of its fiscal prudence, and in terms of this focus on the massive press on capital expenditure, which is really a kind of signature of this government. So, but it has not yet translated into reviving the private investment cycle. So these are little concerns. Broadly, actually, I think the economy on a fairly good track. Coming to the other point, which is about the fiscal deficit, as you mentioned, it is on track. The 5.9% coming down to 5.2% and eventually to 4.5%. but compressing the fiscal deficit by more than 0.7% per year is challenging. It's not undoable, but it is challenging and requires a lot of effort both on the revenue mobilization side and in terms of maintaining expenditure discipline. And that is actually not such an easy job because, as Krishnan was mentioning, if you want to ring fence and preserve your spending of a safety net variety for the vulnerable without compromising on capital expenditure and yet remaining within fiscal deficit ceiling, the math is it's doable, but it's challenging and requires a lot of discipline in managing that. But the other thing is, you see, this is only the center's deficit. Then, for the real deficit economy, you have to look at center plus states. And as Krishnan mentioned, there's some spillover probably on the state side. A lot of the states are also spending off budget. Once you pull all that into the budget and so on, what the picture looks like is not entirely clear because we get to know the state picture well after the financial year is over. But maybe there are some pressures building up there. My guess, and I underline the word guess because we don't have the actual numbers, is that we are somewhere close to 9-10%, the combined fiscal deficit of center plus states. Now that I would juxtapose against a very interesting paper that was written by Sadit Chinoy and his co-author 2 or 3 years ago, and which I think still applies, that there's a kind of knife edge at the nominal growth rate of around 9%. Sorry, not growth rate, but the fiscal growth around 9%. If you are within that, you're not going to get into a stressful debt situation. If you cross that threshold, you're likely to go down into a cycle of increasing debt, increasing deficits, and so forth. So we are close to that. I'm not saying we are above that, but we are close to it. And that is, again, something that we need to manage very carefully. Now, the biggest challenges I think we are facing, and again, Rajiv mentioned this, is actually not so much on the internal side, but on the external front. And I'm not going to talk about that, as I said, because Josh is going to go into it. On the internal side, on the supply side, there may be some challenges in the sense that if you get a food supply shock, and that can happen anytime, nobody controls the monsoon and so on, then you would get a spike in the food price inflation, therefore in the overall inflation, and that can cause stress, especially in financial markets and so forth. But other than that, I think we are okay. I just hope that going forward, the government would spend a little more effort on not so much on just hard infrastructure, but also, and not also just on welfare spending, but on things like education and health, which are state subject, but a lot of influence the center can have through the centrally sponsored schemes. I mentioned this, and this is my last point, because if you look at what the ASER report that came out about a week ago tells you, and it's mainly about the 14 to 18 age group. These are people who are going to be the hardcore of our workforce during the period of so-called demographic dividend. Their learning abilities are still, it's improving over time, but it's still very, very poor if you compare what they can read, what they can do compared to class 2 texts or class 2 math problems and so on. So we have a long way to go there. And without improving that foundation, I have to get these people to be very productive and earn well in decent jobs and, really get India to take advantage of this potential demographic dividend will be challenging. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That's again dot on time. Appreciate your remarks. Josh, now over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Krishnan. So now we've had two speakers so far who've used the words challenging international situation, and on the one hand, that sounds a little bit scary because everyone knows that challenging is a euphemism for bad, right? But on the other hand, there's a feeling, well, who cares about the international situation? I mean, unless you're talking about the price of oil, which everyone understands. If the price of oil goes up, that's really bad news for the Indian economy. But otherwise, why does it really matter for India? So I don't have that much time, but I want to spend a few minutes trying to make the case to you that actually there's a reason why two of the panelists mention the international situation, because it really does matter to India. And I want to tell the story of the last few years. There are different ways you can tell the story of what's happened to India's growth in the past few years. And both panelists have told the story in their own way. Let me tell it in a third way, right? In 2021, when the economy was looking to rebound after being knocked very badly by the pandemic, suddenly there was a fantastic gift from abroad. And that gift was that the Western economies were struggling to produce goods. And so they all came on to India's door, knocking to ask if India had any goods that it could spare to supply, say, the US. And India's answer was, sure, we can do it. And India did do it. Goods exports in 2021 increased by 37% in dollar terms. 37%, right? This provided a huge income windfall to India and helped spark the excellent growth that India saw in 2021. Then in 2022, there was almost the invention, I'm exaggerating, of course, but the invention of something called GCCs, Global Capability Centers, where after the pandemic was over, all the firms, a lot of them American firms, let's just say American firms, decided that, well, if we're going to allow workers to work remotely, what's the difference between allowing them to work in Boston and having them work in Bangalore? Technologically, there's no difference. The big difference is, of course, the pay. It's much cheaper to hire workers out of Bangalore. So service exports in 2022 increased by 27%, again in dollar terms. So this combination of the big increase in goods exports in 2021 and the big increase in service exports in 2022 provided a flood of dollars and, let's just call it, income into the Indian economy. Then came 2023. 2023, the people who received this income, all these workers who were hired for the global capability centers, for example, they started spending this money. Actually, it started spending it earlier, of course, but it really, really started to benefit the economy in 2023. What did you see in 2023? A housing boom and an SUV boom in India. Where did the money for these houses and SUVs come from? They came in very large part from the workers who were hired in these GCCs. How do we know this? Because if you look carefully at the data as to where housing is booming, it's all in the IT cities. For example, the housing starts in Hyderabad are almost as much as they are in Bombay. Why? Right? How can that be? Because of IT money. So I would say that yes, the global economy has played a very, very important role. Aside from the other factors, I'm not trying to deny this, just trying to tell another story, right? You know, the reforms of the government, the capex of the government, and other things. But it's played a very, very important role in India's economy. So then you have to ask the question, what next, right? Because if a lot of the spending on, say, housing was fueled by this income from abroad plus a credit boom, because there's been a huge boom in retail credit in India, then credit booms can't last forever because ultimately you need the income to repay the debts. And if the international situation is challenging, then what happens to the Indian economy? And the answer there is twofold, and I know I'm running out of time, so I'll be really, really brief. Either you need a renewed export boom to provide more income, or you need private capex to pick up, right? Which is why the previous commentators have mentioned these two subjects as being very, very critical. And then, so what's the prospect for that? It's a little cloudy. It's a little cloudy. The U.S. has been growing nicely, but China has slowed down. Europe is in the doldrums, and the U.S. has a very, very particular problem, a very, very strange problem, and it relates to a question that people ask me all the time. They say, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates in order to defeat inflation. Inflation has come down in the US. Why isn't the Fed reducing interest rates? There's a reason for that. And it ties in with all the things I've just been saying, which is that the US economy has been doing so well that there's a danger that it may be running out of workers. And the Fed is very, very worried about this because if it cannot get more workers into the labor force, then what's going to happen is employers are going to start increasing wages in order to attract people into the labor force, and that's going to generate a lot more inflation. And so they're very afraid that this might be coming, and therefore they're very afraid of lowering interest rates. So from India's perspective, there are kind of two problems, right? One is, well, it kind of all depends. If workers start flooding into the labor force without firms having to really raise wages, then the US economy continues to expand. It continues to demand more imports from India, and that will help India's growth. If the US kind of runs out of workers and the Fed needs to keep interest rates high, that's bad for India on two counts, because it means US growth will be low and interest rates will be high. It's way too early to know which way things are going in the US, but I would definitely say this is something to keep an eye on, particularly because it helps answer the question of where India is going to be going.
Thank you. Thank you. It was excellent, and you actually saved a minute, which, with your permission, I can transfer to Ila. Ila, you get 11 minutes now.
Thank you, Dr. Krishnan. And thank you, Josh, for that extra 1 minute. What I'm going to try to do is to bring in the perspective of the private sector and address the question that Krishnan raised on why is private investment not picking up. And I'm going to quickly go through when the problem started, what were the responses of the government, are there any remaining problems, and what are they and what should be done? So we saw that the investment decline in private investment started in about 2011-12. So post the global financial crisis, it seemed as if India hasn't been hit for a while, and then slowly we realized no, private investment in India is getting hit. There was a twin balance sheet problem. The corporates' balance sheets were problematic. Bank balance sheets were problematic. So both had they were non-performing assets. There was also a policy paralysis. So remember 2011-12, and there was this whole feeling that it is policy, it is you don't get permissions, infrastructure projects are stuck, environmental clearances are not given. The government responded by things like a single window for clearances. Then the new government comes in, and then there were a lot of things like the bankruptcy code, so that bank and balance sheets got cleared up. All that happened, and yet today, despite all these policy responses, we are still in a situation where we are, what, 12, 13, 11, 12 years later, asking the question, why is private investment not picking up? While we talk about growth, we talk about, India is the fastest growing economy, very attractive demographics, young, healthy, educated, English speaking population, urbanizing. Still, the driver of growth, as Rajiv pointed out, has been public investment. And as Krishnan said, states are investing a lot, but it is not private investment still. So the question really is, what is it that is holding back private investment? After all, if you look at a stable macroeconomy, fiscal deficit under control, even inflation under control, first time in I think my life I've seen inflation rates in India being lower than inflation rates in the US, with interest rates reasonable, compared to global standards, India being the fastest economy. Why is private investment, whether it's FDI or domestic investment, not really coming in? Now, what I've learned in the last 2 years, I would say, since I moved over from the DEA side, where all of us have been, to working with the private sector, I have found, like, I would say, three key things which worries the private sector. The first is, I think they all translate into one thing, and that is higher costs compared to the rest of the world, and compared mainly to the big manufacturers of the world. So I'll stick to manufacturing for the in the interest of time for just this discussion. Services, we have an advantage, and especially after post-COVID. So if you think about manufacturing, then that's where the big investment doesn't happen. So the concern is, who is currently the big manufacturer in the world? China also has had this go out policy or global expansion strategy, uh, which means that the Chinese government supports Chinese companies to go and invest abroad. And they have set up, Chinese companies have set up industries. So if you think of Vietnam, we're seeing a boom in Vietnam. You would all have heard about that. But that's a lot of Chinese investment that's come into Vietnam. Similarly, all over the world, Chinese companies are going, supported by the Chinese government, and investing abroad. So I'm just saying it's not just China, but it's also other manufacturing that's happening in the rest of the world. So, what worries investors is that actually we do have a competitive disadvantage because of lower costs of production in due to logistics, due to energy costs, as well as due to taxes. And these, in combination with the policy framework. So, a lot of the other problems have been solved. So I won't really go into what has been solved, but what hasn't. So today they're getting the environment clearances. Today they're getting more stability than they were earlier. GST has given them an integrated market, and so on. So out of the remaining concerns which are still stopping private investment happening, I'll give you a couple of examples just to clarify what are the kind of issues that they face. So, for example, the ASEAN FTA means that you get products from, say, Indonesia at zero duties. Now, when you look at the same product in India, that product faces a coal cess, an electricity duty at the state level, an electricity duty at the central level, and then in logistics, because of both just the infrastructure as well as various taxes, logistics are more expensive, power is more expensive. So, but in the context of duties, there are a lot of duties that are not in GST. Now, what is in GST? A similar duty is imposed on even the imports that are coming, say, in my example, from Indonesia. But when it comes to countries where if you were exporting, so pretty much with the FTA, we have made India an international market. Now, while for the exporters we do the roadtep, the roadtep is remission of duties and export, etc., etc., whatever it's the rest of it is called, long name. But essentially, all these, if you are exporting, then you would get a part of the duties outside the GST that you have paid, all these cesses back. Now, these amount to sometimes 5%, 6%, 11% of your price. You do not get those if it is in the domestic market. So, despite the fact that the domestic market is booming, urbanizing, so on and so forth, it still puts the domestic producer at a disadvantage compared to, say, the Indonesian exporter. Now, what what is the response? What has been the policy response? The policy response to this whole thing has been, as I said, one, you try to help exporters. You say, okay, we want India's exports to go up, and so you do the road tap, which has been challenged in the WTO. For domestic, you say we will do a PLI scheme. So this is pretty much what the PLI scheme is, that it tries to compensate you for all the disadvantages that you have. But the PLI scheme means that the government handpicks certain sectors. It gives out some money, so that's also limited. It limits the impact that a government can have. So these are not, broad-based reforms, and even the pickup is not there for broad-based, but it is in certain sectors. And also, it's only for a few years. What happens when, after 5 years or however long the scheme may be, when that ends? So, is it the solution? And should private investors? Yes, many investors have come through for PLI, but it has not led to a broad based pickup in private investment, because clearly the fact that you have a road tap and the fact that you have that PLI scheme tells you that if you were to get many goods, which today we are getting through FTAs, at zero duty, then Indian producers are at a disadvantage, because if they were not, you didn't have to didn't have to put these schemes in place at all. So, what do producers worry about before taking an investment decision? I have 1 minute left. Yes. This is my 11 minutes, right? Not the 10, right? So, what do they worry about? They worry about things like, okay, China is slowing down. Okay, that is a big thing. That if China is slowing down, China starts, or the whole, ASEAN region as well, along with China, slows down, because these are part of global supply chains, and if that region slows down, they start selling or exporting, including to India, at variable cost. Okay, do I put down an investment of 5,000 crore, 7,000 crore for something where tomorrow I may not be able to recover my costs? So the question that comes up while making these decisions is to do not just with the external environment, but to do with what sort of a policy response then there will be to these questions. And they're all tricky. GST is not in the budget, not with the DEA or the Ministry of Finance. It's a broader issue, but I think as a country, not getting private investment back on track is a serious problem, and that should be studied and understood. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sheila. I want to thank all my panelists for excellent discipline. On the dot of 4:55, as planned, we finished the round one, and we have time for questions. Unlike a lot of our typical discussions, we have good 15-20 minutes. So now the floor is open. If you can identify yourself and make your question or comment brief. Thank you.
I have a small query from Felman.
So if you can introduce
Yeah, yeah. How much contribution do you expect from the external economic intervention, that is foreign investment, etc.? What is the attribution, a growth attribution of this external economic intervention? That's one question for you. Another question for Sudipto Mundle is that you expect the rate of growth of 7% plus, etc. But given the high level of income disparity, inequity, demand being very low, and is likely to be low further, do you expect that under that circumstances, the growth which you are projecting would materialize, or you think there is going to be some problem when we are projecting it? Particularly if you look at the income distribution of 2023, it's quite disturbing. You know, the 15% are in destitutes, another 15% are at margin. Only 50% are able to pay for something, and rich are almost 3%, and they don't generate demand. Demand is generated from the lower and upper middle class, lower middle class. The white goods demand is generated by the upper middle class. So given the structure of distribution of our economy, I don't think that we are going to cross 7% of this growth.
Thank you. Thank you. Since you would be leaving in another few minutes, sir, so in case there are questions, I want to make sure that we get Dr. Mandal's response before he leaves. He had a prior commitment. Our program was supposed to end at 5. So I want to make sure that we don't delay him. In addition to this question, there are specific questions addressed to Dr. Mandal. If not, sir, if you can respond now, I'll take the other questions.
Thank you. No, that's an excellent question. In principle, I agree with you that certainly high and rising inequality is not very helpful from the demand perspective. But that being said, if you look at what share of even the consumption demand is coming from if you will, the lower income classes, and you gave examples. A lot of the manufacturing output, if you take out food, I mean, the highest share of demand of poorer classes, as we call it, the Angel's curve and so on, goes for food, and then for textiles and so on. A lot of what is being produced, the sector which have been doing well, actually are not catering to the demand of the poor people. And so you can have a growth model which it's not desirable in a value sense, but it's viable. It's something we used to call as kids. We have children, young students call it the Brazilian model. Very unequal. You promote and you basically grow on the basis of luxury sector and high rich demand. So it can happen, especially if it is supported by this big push of public investment. I'm not saying that it is something that is a desirable path, and both Krishnan and I did mention that it is important to ring fence not just welfare spending, but I'm particularly concerned about the poor investment in human development. Because the big workforce that we have, which is coming on board, actually the skill levels are very poor because they have had very poor training. And unless we can fix that, I'm afraid we might just miss the demographic dividend. So, in brief, I do agree with you. Whether it will be sub 7%, 2%, 0.2 more or less, I can't really say.
Now, one supplementary, you are saying that manufacturing is growing, but manufacturing competing with SMEs, and therefore you find other sector is also getting low. there is a conflict on the SMEs as well as manufacturing sector, and as well as we are getting imports from various countries. So there is a real trouble. Manufacturing is going on the other side. SMEs production is going down, and they are competing with internally as well as externally.
Thank you. Are there, thank you, sir. Other questions around the table? Siddharth?
Sir, good evening, everybody. Sir, I wanted to ask you, none of you have touched on this. Mr. Krishnan talked about it, Dr. Krishnan talked about it, that we had a double-digit growth in toward in the initial part of the decade. So, any thoughts on that? Because we are talking about 7%, and so how do we get to the double-digit growth which we have registered some time back?
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Dipali. So, what I gather is that our manufacturing hasn't really taken up as much as it should have been. And in the education sector, as Professor Rajiv just said, that the ESSER report is saying that we are still lacking the skills, and with the so majority of the employment coming from the services sector, the IT. But with this whole
you had mentioned about the service sector, we see something. What are the resultant vulnerabilities that have been created in the Indian economy because of this reform? How do we safeguard this when we can? Will it suddenly evaporate? Can it evaporate? Like vulnerabilities.
So, thank you, sir. I'd have one, I'm Rajeshwar Singh. I'd have one further question really on monetary policy, because Dr. Mishra reflected the Reserve Bank view that there may be a need to squeeze out excess liquidity from the system. But I'm certain Dr. Patnaik might agree with me that most market participants and banks have the opposite view, that there is simply not enough liquidity in the system. So there seem to be two views, one held by the market, that we are facing a liquidity crunch in the market, and one held by the government that we may be having excess liquidity. So how do we reconcile this?
Thank you. Other questions? With your permission, can I add one sort of comment or a question? Given that bulk of the growth that has come in the recent times and what we see in the next couple of years is going to be state capex, do we have any sort of sense of the differential incremental capital output ratio of government capex versus private capex? Does India have data of this kind? Because I don't recall any. So will government capex lead to the kind of growth, the point that Siddharth made, the kind of growth that we saw when private capex led the effort? One. More important, in the light of what both you said, Josh, and what Hila said, the recent, the debates that, for instance, Raghuram Rajan and Lamba put forth, the view that they put forth, that the old manufacturing with not necessarily very high skilled labor, but manufacturing for exports and in turn leading to growth is a bus that we missed 25 years ago. Two, the nature of manufacturing has changed. It is so service embedded and so skill embedded that if India wants to broadly replicate the China, Malaysia, Vietnam type export-led growth effort, we would need to be different both in our approach to manufacturing and services, taking us back to the point that Dr. Mundle made, namely serious investments in health, education, capabilities, etc., etc. So any views on this? And I think anyone can pick up any question. And as promised, we will start in the reverse order. Ila first, Josh later, and then Rajiv will, as government always does, have the last word.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
So let me pick up on the question of manufacturing. Now, since I work for a group that is into manufacturing, both so we are a group called the Aditya Birla Group, which has companies like Hindalco, which produce aluminium and copper, and Grasim, which produces pulp and fiber, Ultratech, which produces cement. When I see a lot of scope for manufacturing in India, it might not be that we are going to copy somebody else's models, but when I look at the sort of sales that Ultratech is able to do, or even Hindalco is able to do, it's not just for public investment, though infrastructure does count for a lot of it, but even private people are now building houses. So there's a huge, apart from even what, in addition to what Josh said, which is like, the GCC centers where you see that upper end premiumization of, premium housing and launches and multi-story buildings. But even at the lower end, all over the country, we are seeing that something happened in COVID, something happened to preferences. So they're not buying our textiles as much as they are buying our cement. So there has been a shift in preferences. People are borrowing. Half the increase in personal credit in the banking system is for housing. So people are buying houses. They're also, buying vehicles. So that's the second category, which helps the manufacturing of things like EVs, copper, aluminium, and so forth. I don't think that we should be just sitting up and saying that story is over. We see manufacturing. There are difficulties, of course. There are difficulties, but those policy issues. There are policy issues. So there are even if I think about textiles. Textiles is something that maybe today Bangladesh is doing because they'll also stop being a poor in LDC, and then the tariffs from products in Bangladesh increase. But it's not that we can't do that. So we have factories in Bangladesh and we have factories in India, and it's not that all hope is lost in India. Long answer, but sorry about that. But I feel very strongly about this.
Do you want to take any of the other questions? I've actually touched upon. Yeah. So, Josh, you didn't respond on monetary policy, liquidity.
Yeah, I agree, as you expected me to agree, that the problem that arises a lot of the time is because of the forex intervention. So we are so busy trying to, keep the rupee stable, that the impact it has on liquidity conditions in the market sometimes are put at second priority and not looked at. But yes, the market needs more liquidity and the conditions that are there, and that should be the focus. I agree.
Okay, so I was asked specifically two questions. One about the vulnerability from particularly the service export windfall, and also about FDI. Let me take them in reverse order. Sure. Every bit of good news always has a downside to it, right? Absolutely. Right. How can I disagree? Right. So what are the downsides? The downsides to this big GCC windfall are one, that people, when they got this income windfall, they went out and they put down payments on housing, but they also borrowed for mortgages. They also borrowed again for SUVs. They also borrowed again for the furniture that is going into the houses that are being completed. So there is a little bit of a vulnerability building up in the banking system with all these personal loans. If something were to go wrong, and these people say lose their jobs, then there will be a big mess in the banking system, and no one will be able to get any credit. I don't I don't really rate this as a huge risk, but it is a risk, right? Uh, the more, the other, it's not, the other vulnerability is kind of the one that I mentioned. All right, so India got one windfall, two windfalls, the money's being spent, which is leading to a construction boom. But then what next? What's the driver of growth, right? After that, and as I said, it's got to be either another sort of big shift, a big export boom of some kind, either in goods or in services, another big shift, say, of services to India. But we don't know about that because of, say, AI. Certainly over the past year, service exports have leveled off, so have goods exports for that matter. Um, uh, and so it just kind of creates a question of sort of if that doesn't happen, if the private investment doesn't happen, then what happens to growth? Um, if I have some time, I'll get back to all these issues. But let me now switch to FDI. Yes, FDI, as everybody knows, has been going down, and it's not. India has lost market share in global FDI, and this is really very, very disappointing, right? The government has put a lot of effort into, first Make in India and then the PLI schemes. Uh, uh, India should have this demographic advantage, which China has completely lost. People are trying to shift out of China. It's really disappointing that India has lost market share in FDI, and uh, so there. The question really is what can be done to reverse, to sort of inject more life into the schemes to attract FDI, and I'll kind of leave this as an open question, and say that I hope maybe some clue will be given in the budget. And if I have some time later, I do want to get back to the specific question of the budget. But I'll,
You can do it now.
okay, we have time? Okay, so,
Sorry, didn't you point out in the opening slide that the FDI has bounced back in October 23?
But,
So,
yeah, so
um, that's 1 month. Generally, FDI has slid. It's slid for two reasons. One is that all over the world, partly because the Fed has raised interest rates, the funding conditions for startups are just terrible. Because when the Fed was running interest rates at zero, it was a great game for investors to borrow money and then invest in startups because it didn't cost you anything and you had the potential of making a lot of money. And that game is now over. And so a lot of the FDI that went into startups in the IT sector, including in India, but all over the world, that money has gone away. All right, well, there's nothing India can do about this. The more disappointing one is just the lack of FDI in manufacturing.
no, but actually what I was querying was that there was a statement that in October
Yes,
2023, there's been a bounce back.
yeah, but over a
Is-
longer
is-
time
is there-
period.
Is there a setback again?
Well,
Is this
over a
not
longer
insufficient?
time period, if you look at what's happened over the whole course of 2023, FDI has dropped very, very sharply in India. FDI into India.
And if I may come in with a question at this late stage, the other thing that has been worrying me is in this review, what we read is that even with whatever growth that has happened, it has gone much more to a few individuals in the country than it has across the board. And so, what is the state of the economy for the larger public rather than for the...
That's what I.
So all the difficult
Yeah.
questions will be answered by Rajiv.
Well,
Yeah.
I think this is one reason why all of us have stressed the importance of manufacturing. Ilya's made an eloquent case, but generally we all of us, the government, outside, people in industry, we all understand that manufacturing is vitally important if you want to if you want to broad base the growth, the gains from growth. Exactly. Let me just pose my question. It's really for Rajiv, but I know you can't answer this question. But let me just throw out a few budget numbers. Um, uh, a few. If you go back to fiscal 19, which was the last, say, normal year, fiscal 20, there was a disaster, was a very bad year for the Indian economy, partly because you had a blow up in the NBFCs. If you go back to fiscal 19, the budget deficit was 3.5. I'm rounding numbers. This year, it should be about 6. So there's been a 6% of GDP. So there's been an increase in the budget deficit of about 2.5 percentage points, even though probably revenue has increased by about 0.5 percentage point. So the reason the budget deficit has expanded has been because spending has increased by 3 percentage points of GDP. Right? Now, if this were all due to CapEx, you might say, well, we really don't care because the CapEx will generate growth, growth will generate tax revenues down the line, and that will kind of pay for investments that we're doing now. But only half of this increase, this 3 percentage point increase, has been due to CapEx. The other half is current expenditure, split more or less equally amongst higher interest payments, higher subsidies, and higher schemes. Now, if you the problem is that, as Sudipto was mentioning, if nominal growth continues the way it does and deficits continue the way it does, the debt will just keep growing and growing. The debt has increased to beyond 80% of GDP, and it's probably going to go up again this year. And so something needs to be done to rein in the deficit so that debt doesn't keep growing and growing and growing. And the question really that I would like answered in the budget, and I know Rajiv can't answer it now, that's not fair to ask him. But what I would be looking for in the budget is how we know the imperative. The imperative is to wind back the deficit, but where will it come from? Interest payments have to be paid. You can't cut them. The subsidy schemes have rationales. We don't want to cut them. The schemes that were introduced have rationales. We don't want to cut them. The CapEx, we don't want to cut them. So what is there left to cut here? How do you wind back the deficit? Of course, the ideal situation is that you get an economic boom and revenues just start flooding in, and then you have no problem. But that kind of gets back to the whole issue where we started. We're having problems generating private capex and generating that boom. So the government, as I see it, is in a very tough spot. And one of the things that I would be looking forward in the budget is just some idea of how they think the government can maneuver in this as they say, challenging situation.
What do you?
Yes, let me do my best to the extent possible. Okay. Regarding, sir, your question about high growth in the early 2000s, I would take the period from 2000 to 2008. Your observation is correct. We think that the high growth of Indian economy was mostly due to a booming international trade, which was also stimulating private corporate investment. Right now, that is not the case. Trade has slowed considerably, not only recently, but soon even after taper tantrum, because of which we had a financial sector mess also in the country when the promised returns could not materialize on the private capital. So, apart from the reasons which Ms. Patnaik has stated regarding why private investment is not growing on the supply side, I would add the demand side also. As long as trade does not boom, we are going to have a problem with private investment. That is the first thing. Second, ma'am, I'll take your question about the manufacturing. I understand the concern. Presently, the share of manufacturing in GVA has been declining, and over the last 7-8 years, the decline is steady, and we are around 14% of manufacturing is 14% of GVA as per the latest estimates available with us. But I think we have to look at these things a bit differently as well. We know that world over, there is a productivity improvement in the manufacturing sector as compared to the rest of the sectors, because of which prices keep on declining on the manufactured output. So this lower share of manufacturing in GVA also takes factors in the issue of relative prices in manufacturing declining. So if you were to offset that and look only at the share of manufacturing at constant prices, not current prices, you would see that the share has actually been rising over the last several decades, and right now it is 18%. So in volume terms, we are not doing so badly. In price terms of those products, it seems to us that the share is really that bad. But I've not settled this issue by saying this, because this can be a constant debate. Third, sir, regarding your question on monetary policy, I was referring to a time period, maybe 6 to 8 months back, when the policy rates had risen and there was talk that it would not further increase. At that point in time, quantitative tightening was one of the tools available to the RBI to do the, further do the monetary tightening. Right now, that tightening must have been completed. In addition to that, if government is, if RBI is selling dollars in the market to well, I wouldn't say use the word stabilize the rupee, because RBI will have a strong objection to it. But keeping that aside, in its normal exchange operations, if they are selling the dollars and that is sucking out the liquidity from the economy, then maybe to that extent the sterilization has not been done. And this process is, in fact, leading to further. In fact, it's a good thing that there's a complaint regarding the tight liquidity situation. It means that the tightened monetary policy is effective, is working in the country. Well, that is my personal view. The fourth point, sir, you talked about the state ICOR. It's a thing which we have not really looked at in the ministry. We have generally gone by a paper from NIPFP, I think it was 2015 or something like that, where the capex multiplier was estimated at 4.104, around that figure.
For the economy.
For the economy. Yes, not for the public. So it's a capex multiplier. And as far as the revenue multiplier is concerned, it was about one itself. So that itself brought in the argument that if we want to accelerate growth, it's better to put money in capex rather than on putting money in the hands of the people. That's a thought. Then, regarding the net FDI issue, we are of the view in the ministry about this net FDI that, of course, the global factors are controlling the decline in FDI in H1 so far, which India has seen. This decline is mostly on account of repatriation. We have the gross FDI coming in, but it is then repatriated back to the parent country, because of which the net FDI is coming down. This did not happen so much in October. That's why the figure jumped up. But again, it has re-happened, and the figure in November is coming down again. Now, there's another view which says that this money which is being repatriated is coming back into the country through FPI. So while net FDI might be going down, net FPI is rising. Although this is not really a documented fact elsewhere, but this is one of the thinking going on in many circles. That is one issue. So, and this repatriation is happening mainly because of, I would say, uncertainty. Now, uncertainty does not happen only when policy rates are rising. In fact, uncertainty increases when nothing seems to be happening. In fact, I'm very grateful to Mr. Joshua for giving me this insight about why US Fed rates are not increasing, because they might just run out of workers to produce that output. That could be one reason. But the thing is, there's a pause all around. So that has added to uncertainty, and this is perhaps one reason why, again, money, the dollars are being kept where in areas which are considered to be safe havens. Regarding lastly, the fiscal deficit side of there's another point I think was made about inequality of income distribution. This is a factor which we have dealt with in the collection of essays which we recently produced in the ministry. It was released in December. We are not so much worried about the inequality in the macro sense unless it starts weakening the demand. And I think this point was earlier made as well. But if it is only looking at inequality, we tend to give more importance to poverty. We have to reduce poverty. That should be the main target. If inequality is worsening, that is the next stage battle. But a primary battle is like looking at our priorities clearly. Are we so much worried about reducing inequality that we ignore the fact that poverty may not be declining? So the target of the government is reduction in poverty. Lastly, about the fiscal deficit, you are right. I'm not able to at this stage share what the government must be thinking, but there are things which I think independent analysis can also talk about. And in fact, I mentioned in the beginning also, one way of reducing fiscal deficit is to retire your debt. This has not been happening, but I think this is going to be the main objective going forward, when, assuming that market conditions improve and we have remonetization of the assets, we have disinvestment, monetization of assets and disinvestment of the public sector enterprises. That about all.
Increasing. How do you expect you are going to retire it? And it has increased during last few more years, one thing. Secondly, you said about ICOR of the capital output ratio multiplier effect. Which is the sector where you think that the investment going on, or the announcement to investment has made, which will lead to higher multiplier or higher investment capital output ratio? I don't see the kind of statement they have made in the press and etc. The investment is leading to certain manufacturing sector, which will lead to the higher multiplier effect or high capital output ratio, which is not visible right now. But you may be knowing more because you are close to this. Second one, last point. To both of you, I think what is our impact of, because there is a lot of hype on the FDI, has been hype on FDI for a long time. And what is the impact on the internal investment which takes place, or it is following the FDI route in terms of where the FDI is, the internal investment also goes there. What is the kind of trajectory you are seeing it?
I'm not sure we have the time to respond in detail. So should we take up some of these immediately after this in the tea? Because it's close to 5:30. So, with your permission, sir. I'll just say a few words and hand over the mic to you, sir. Thank you. Thanks, Rajiv. Thanks, Ela, and thanks, Joshua, and my thanks to Dr. Mundle. Such a rich discussion is not, it's not possible for me to sort of summarize this, except to say that, at one level, it somewhat sounds like what Dr. Mundle said about his own experience 35 years ago, that we know all the problems, we actually know all the solutions. Can we do them? A private sector capex clearly needs to be given a push, but it is a complex set of policy levers that we need to operate. Ela drew attention to some of them, and Rajiv again drew attention to some of them. But I just want to express one sort of minor worry here, which is, in my early years in government, young deputy secretary, when one would look at some of these interim measures, saying that while we solve the sort of deeper problems in the longer term, we will do something as interim solutions. And if I protested, I'd be told, no, wait for the long term, this will be done. I have retired, and all those interim measures keep recurring, and I'm told I need to wait for the long term. I'm a little worried because, for instance, PLI. So PLI is an interim measure, but I mean, this is in my lifetime the fifth or the sixth or the seventh interim measure, and we keep seeing interim measures every 5 years. One wonders when we will actually hit the long term. But clearly, near consensus, and I think on this all of us are agreed, much greater investments in HRD, that is all of human resources, whether it's health, education, women and child development, all those sectors. But I think equally important, we didn't get the time to discuss this, the state capability to make sure that all of these investments actually lead to outcomes. Because it's not as if we are not spending large amounts of money. Yes, we need to spend more, but I think we also need to beef up state capacity to get more out of the expenditure. But now I'll hand over to Mr. Srivastava, the director, for concluding remarks and vote of thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Krishnan. All of you will agree that we had a very, very fruitful discussion on the subject. Actually, when we are critically reviewing the doing the midterm review of the economy, we get a mixed feeling. Certain, it has also come out, during the discussion and the deliberation that followed, that certain areas we have done quite well, and we should feel very happy and proud of. One subject which was not touched, I'd like to mention is the digital promotion of digital economy. Now, this is something which is unprecedented, and the kind of growth, the kind of popularity that it has gained is something very heartening. When you go to even small markets, to a vegetable vendor, to a fruit vendor, etc., he is preferring to have transaction with you digitally. Amount is immaterial, it's 5 rupees, 10 rupees, 20 rupees, that is immaterial. This is something really very heartening, and I'm told that this unprecedented scale of transaction that is taking place in India perhaps is not taking place anywhere in the world. But this has also helped in preventing the leakages. The direct tax, direct benefit transfer schemes was implemented. Jan Dhan accounts have been opened. They've all been. I mean, they're all really good measures taken by the government to see that the leakages are prevented, and we should feel very happy about that. Regarding the capex spend, it is clearly brought out the government spending has definitely gone up. But what is really saddening is that the private sector spending is not taking place. And this should really make us to sit up and take cognizance of as to why it is not happening. GDP is growing, no doubt. Tax buoyancy is being noticed. I think on year-on-year basis, I think Rajiv will confirm. I think the tax growth is somewhere in the range of 20% or so. The implementation of uh, electronic filing of what you call self-assessment, system of your filing return has helped a great deal. Tax compliances have really gone up, and all these have definitely added to the tax growth. Fiscal deficit narrowing may not be to the level that we all would like to have, but certainly it's a very good thing to happen. But the causes of concern are the following, which was also mentioned. The income disparity is growing tremendously. The growth is jobless growth. Very few jobs are being created. It is causing a lot of consternation all over the country, particularly in the smaller towns and rural areas. In the Human Development Index ladder, we are far, far below, and this should really make us feel concerned. And what all is required to be done must be done and done quickly. Now, coming back to this private investment, I remember the days when I spent in the Ministry of Civil Aviation, where we're building airport infrastructure. Today, we can say very proudly that the work which was done in that period, I'm talking of 2006 to 2009-10, we have been able to build up airport infrastructure all over the country, and they are really world class. We can feel very proud of. I remember that period, the kind of interest which the private sector was showing in investing in the airport infrastructure and at the same time also in the road, that is now lacking. Now, this should make us to think as to why it is not happening, why private sector is not going forward in investing. And let me say very firmly that unless the Indian private sector start investing in India, forget about FDI coming. The people who are going to do FDI in India, they are looking at these Indian investors because their investing is going to create a kind of conducive environment which will inspire others to come and invest. So, what are the reasons for that? We have to really take. Is it the kind of role which the investigating agencies are playing? A sort of fear, atmosphere has been created. I mean, is it really inhibiting the private sector to come forward? Uh, I mean, there are several other reasons could be, but I think is there is lack of dialogue between the private sector and government. I mean, we have to really take cognizance of this issue and try to sort it out, instill confidence in the Indian private sector, make them to invest, and I'm sure with their investing, the foreign investment definitely will come. Friends, let me just a piece of information to all of you that the deliberations of today's discussion, today's program, are going to be printed by us in the form of a report, and we send a copy of this report to all the members of IISc. We also place its soft copy on our website so that those who are interested to know as to what we have discussed, they can also access and see. So if let me now thank profusely Josh Felman, Ila Patnaik, Sudipto Mundle, Rajiv Mishra for their presence, for their participation, for their very, very informative talk and deliberations. And we look forward for their more and more association in the years ahead, in the months ahead with IISc. I would also like to thank Dr. K.P. Krishnan, who very, very competently conducted the proceedings, moderated the entire discussion, etc. And I am one who is his real admirer. You can't find another Krishnan in every sense. Be it is his competence, be his inclination to help others. I have never seen anything called no or cannot be done kind of thing with Krishnan. Meet him, he will always be able to help. He'll always be able to find a solution to every problem. Thanks a lot, Krishnan, for your. So, friends, once again, I profusely thank all of you, and I request all of you to kindly join us for tea and snacks in Terrace Pergola, just next to this venue. Thank you very much.
सर एक चीज और मेंशन कर दूं, डायरेक्टर साहब जो अभी प्राइवेट इन्वेस्टमेंट की बात कर रहे थे, जेवर एयरपोर्ट जो है सर ने ही अप्रूव किया था तभी ये बना है, जो आज आ रहा है ये सेकंड एयरपोर्ट, ये सर ने वो 2007-8 में आई वाज इन ग्रेटर नोएडा अथॉरिटी एज चीफ इंजीनियर, आई मेट हर सर, लेकिन सर मेड इट पॉइंट कि वो 100 किलोमीटर वाला जो बार था ना प्राइवेट सेक्टर वाला, वो सर ने कैसे किया ये पता नहीं, लेकिन ये जो एयरपोर्ट आएगा ना वो सर का ही अप्रूवल था।